we advocate for the things we feel are right in our community, and also we learn to educate ourselves on the network and the computer. Here are some of the cultural things you can see beads, very colorful and very traditionally made. Culture, as you all know, is a custom of the people, their tradition and their rights. As you can see, I'm well cultured in my church's uniform. Culture has greatly impacted by modernity, and this has led to it being suppressed. As a result, it has a lot of negative effects on our youth as a whole, our society, and even our parents. Some of these negative effects include the youth forgoing their national language, or should I say their dialect. For some music we know as rap, popular songs are like songs of Lil Wayne, T.I. Ezekiel. Also, some of them tend to put their trousers below their waist, which is really floppy because they think it's fashion. Meanwhile, they are dictating, or they are acting like moral decadence to the Cameroonian culture. That is not all. To add to that, some of our Cameroonian youths, they tend to disrespect their parents, and even when they try to bring them up to the right path, they believe that the parents are doing them harm just because they believe that in the Western society or the American kid is not disciplined or not beaten. Meanwhile, they fail to understand that not by beating them, they are also disciplined, and this has led to the destroying and elimination of our culture, which we must fight against if we must preserve it, not only for ourselves but for the future generations. Hi, I'm Emmanuella. I'm a member of Yankton. I believe it's a club which you also already in. And in Yankton, I'm based on culture, and with your permission, which you have granted, I would like to ask you a few questions about culture, especially the modernity. The effects modernity is having on our culture. For example, from what I know so far, modernity has been suppressing our culture, and it has been having a lot of negative impacts, especially on our youth. So as a youth, what do you think is influencing your fellow mates to backslide from the culture? Because it is normally said the youth are the backbone of our Cameroon of tomorrow.
Well, this thing of modernity influencing our culture can be drawn back from the colonial times when the European nations are annexing us as colonial masters. As we know, the European, when they annexed Cameroon, they brought in their own culture here, and their culture is a little bit different from ours. So we can say that the grassroots problem came from the colonial masters, where, as you said, the youths are backsliding from their culture. I wouldn't say we should blame the youth entirely, because it's not exactly their fault. Modernity is the main problem here. As we know, we can learn our culture from our villages, and the youths of today were grown up in the cities. They grew in the city, so that's one of the main problems why they know very little about our culture, and they don't really want to go back and learn. First of all, in our villages, we don't have schools. Educational facilities are not there. As a result, mostly the youths who are the ones going to school now, they will leave the villages and come over to the towns to come and learn. In the course of learning, they forget about home, so they don't go back to learn their culture, and so they grow up without knowing little or not even nothing about their culture.
Okay, just a quick here. Do you know your dialect?
Yeah, I can understand a few part of it.
So how do you say I love my culture in your dialect?
Wow, that's a little bit difficult.
Yeah, if you can do that. But how much more do you know about your culture or your traditions?
Well, the thing is, if someone is speaking my dialect to me, I can really understand it. But to speak it out, since I didn't grow up, like I said, in the village, it's kind of like difficult. But I know a few things about my culture, like our dressing, our traditional meal, and a lot of other few things, that like how our chiefs is being coordinated, and a lot of other things.
Just to go more detailedly, what is your traditional meal?
Well, our traditional meal is, we call it in our dialect, boroko and pepe. Yeah, well, which is normally plantain and fried pepper. You know, so many people mistake this pepper to be like just a normal stuff, but when a real indigene of our village prepares it, I bet you will eat and lick your fingers.
And that village is
Bafakabalwe, which is found in Indian subdivision. Indian division rather, in the Kuniti subdivision.
okay. What do you think our parents are doing about this problem, this fatal problem of our culture being eradicated?
Well, I for one, my parents are doing a lot to see that I learn more about my culture. Like they've been sending me for like a summer holidays. I've spent one in the village where I get to interact with those who are there and learn a little bit about our culture. Also back at home, my father and my mom, they're like teaching me how to speak the dialect. Like I said, I only know how I can understand a few part of it, but the speaking part is quite difficult. So they're speaking it to me and teaching me how to say it. Yeah. So they're like helping to see that I know my culture. So I can say my parents are contributing. They're trying to do their best to see that I know my culture.
Okay, on this note, I would like for you to advise the youth on methods in which they can use to improve on their culture, or tell them some of the negative effects about modernity on our culture.
Well, for the youth, I'll say this. Our culture determines who we are. And if we know very little or nothing about our culture, that means we don't even know who we are. So I'll advise the youth, especially myself, to go back to our villages or ask our parents back at home for them to teach us something about our culture, because that's what determines who we are, who we really are. Now, modernity has come to influence our culture. Yeah, it's very normal that we should go to school and learn something, but nevertheless, we should also be thinking about our culture. We shouldn't learn just the book. Let's learn a little bit about our culture, because as we know, the culture is quite diminishing. Very few people know a lot about our culture, and a bunch of others know nothing. So I'll advise that we go back and learn our culture back at home, because that's what say who we are, who we really are.
Like you said, the culture of a person determines who he is, and that even though we study, we should endeavor to learn our culture. And this is just what a few, or what I should say, a little percentage of the Cameroonian youth we say. But you have to wait until you watch the interview, in which I'm going to do a Westerner, to see what he thinks of our own culture. Thanks, it was nice meeting you.
You're welcome.
Hi, welcome back to the interview. Like last time, I promised after interviewing a youth, which was also a member of the young club which I'm part of, I promised that I was going to interview a Westerner, and here we have a special guest here. So do you mind please telling us your name, where you come from, and your occupation?
Sure. My name is Josh Nathan. I'm from the United States of America. I'm from the Northeast, a town called Boston. And right now I'm a teacher in Cameroon, but my occupation is that I'm a teacher.
Okay, like you already heard from him, he's a teacher, meaning he was going to be able to give us the facts and align the courses detailedly to us. And so you won't do any favoritism, right?
Of course not.
Okay, so in your own words, what do you think like your modernity or civilization had done to our African culture? As we all know, the modernity of Africa was through the partition of Africa in the 1960s, the 90s, in which the Europeans came to Africa and colonized Africa, thereby defining their own spheres of influence. So how do you think that has affected us up to today?
That's a really good question. I think that there are a lot of effects that Westerners have had upon Africa. And when I think of them, I think that you can think of them in many directions. You can think of them in terms of the sorts of products that you can buy. So products like Coca-Cola, which was invented in America, is now everywhere, right? And you can get it anywhere in Africa. So products are definitely one thing that we have kind of exported and that now are very much a part of African culture, but it's because they were a part of American culture. I think that television is another part of that, right? And all the things that are sold on television, but also the television shows that in many cases are things that have come to Africa, maybe from America, maybe actually from other countries, like maybe from Europe, also maybe from Nigeria. Language is something that we have exported, right? We're speaking in English right now, and that's a language that came here from England. And so that's a result of colonization. We're standing in a school right now, and I think the ways that schooling works in Cameroon is a result of how schooling worked in England, and it's something that was exported here. And in fact, I don't know when this building was built, but I know that we're in Boya, where I live, there are a lot of buildings that were built by the Germans and then afterwards by the English. So I think there are lots and lots of parts of culture that have come from Europe and have come to Cameroon and have come from America and come to Cameroon. And it almost is difficult to count the ways because there are so many ways, and they're all so subtle in which American and Western culture has come to influence Cameroon.
Okay, like you said, languages. You said right now you're speaking the English language, which is a fact because that is what we're actually doing right now. But what do you think that languages or that culture has done to our own language, that is our traditional languages? For example, my dialect in the village right now, people like speak to the dialect, expressing themselves. But right now in Cameroon, you see a youth, the mother speaks to her or him in the dialect, and the street is just like ash. Abek, something like that. So what do you think that language barrier has done to our culture?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think language has done a few things in Cameroon. One thing that I worry about is I think that English has taken over and has caused people to speak less and less of their tribal languages. And I think part of that is because people learn it in school, right? You aren't supposed to speak your tribal language in school. You're supposed to speak English. And actually, I know there's one day, the day of the National Day of the Mother Tongue. So it's almost, we say like, there's one day when you're allowed to speak your language, but every other day, it's not appropriate. You have to speak English.
That's discrimination.
And it is kind of discrimination. Now, the sad truth is that a lot of the world's economy works in certain languages, like English, like French. And if you speak those languages, you can get a job in a big city, you can probably make more money. And I think one of the sad things is that if you speak your tribal language but don't speak another language, it's unlikely that you will have as great a job, as great an opportunity in life as if you speak English. And that's not a good thing, but I think it's a true thing about the world. Now there's also what has happened, so the English has kind of taken over a lot, and I worry about languages going extinct. I worry about what happens if someday there aren't any Bakwarians left and nobody is speaking Bakwari, they're only speaking English. I think another thing that's happened that's interesting is that Cameroonians have taken English, but they have made it their own language, and by which I mean Pidgin, right? Pidgin is a language that's spoken here, and it is English, but it's also not English. It's very different. And one thing that I think is really cool about Pidgin is I think it's actually its own language. I think that people here don't have as much respect as they should for Pidgin. And I think the reason is that people think of it as like a language of the market or of the street. It's not the language of school. And in fact, I'll bet if we look around, we'll see some sign somewhere that says speak English, not Pidgin, right?
Yeah.
Or speak French, not Pidgin. Pidgin really is, I think, its own language. And when I hear people speaking Pidgin and then speaking English, they are not speaking, they are not just saying the same language but poorly. They're really going between two different languages. So I think that's actually a cool thing that people have done, is that they've taken this language that has invaded and they've made it into their own thing.
Okay, right now we wish to go to technology. Like as you can see, we are now doing a video and it's by the help of a camera, and we have things like laptops all around, which like broaden the base of the youths and the children and the community alike. But in the olden days, before the European came, we the Africans, we had our own technology. That is, we did our own things. For example, we knew from our sayings that we could manufacture things like hoes, PS, which we used to fend for ourselves and to do our own things. But the Europeans, or you guys, you came and you extracted our raw materials, don't be offended, and you use it, let me say, to improvise on us. But you have to excuse me if I say this, but I think to me that if there is no Africa, there would have been no European, or it wouldn't have been developed as today. So what do you think, if you guys hadn't come here, would have been the outcome technologically?
That's a really, really good question and a really difficult one. And I think one thing I should start by saying is that colonialism is a very complicated process, but and one of the big complexities is, in a lot of ways, it can benefit places by pushing them forward into modernity, but in a lot of ways it destroys local culture and it kills local people. And I think there are terrible, terrible things that colonialism did. So I don't take offense at it at all. I think that colonialism is a really problematic thing. And I think that people in Europe really think a lot on what the colonial history they have is, what their legacy is, and feel very bad about it. Feel like they've done terrible things to local people that are really, really negative. And actually one interesting part of that from my perspective is that I originally am from a country that was colonized, right? America was an English colony. And then they became independent, and then America went and started colonizing other countries, right? So it's really interesting how countries can become colonial after they have been colonized themselves. And I almost think Nigeria might be an interesting example of that. They were colonized by England, but then they almost came and tried to take some of Cameroon, right? So there are interesting histories where people do one thing and then they become, they first are a victim and then they are the aggressor. To answer your question about technology, it's hard to say how it is that Cameroon would progress. I do think that Africans had their own technologies in many ways, and you're right that European technologies came in and almost took those over. I think Africa would have developed in a very different way had Africa had its own technology. And I almost feel like we can dream and imagine, like, what could those technologies have been?
Yeah.
And it's almost impossible to know what could they have been. But you're right, there are things that, cameras have taken over from other technologies. I know one of them that I'm scared is dying away in parts of Africa is oral tradition, is the idea that instead of taking a video of something, we would have a story about it that would tell that instead of taking the video. And I really wonder whether that's a tradition that's dying away because now we have things like cameras, but I don't know if a camera is better than that.
Okay, well, I want to ask, in your own personal way, or if you were to imagine yourself to be an African or a Cameroonian, what do you think you would have loved to happen if you were present at the days back when there were colonialism or the European powers that were coming to annex the countries in Africa?
Wow. I don't know. I think I would have fought really hard to get rid of them. I think I would not have wanted them here. It's hard to say because I think one element, colonialism has lots of elements, and one is military, right? They are taking people over, they are killing people, they are taking their land, and you're really right with what you said, there would be no Europe without Africa. Europe got all of its money from elsewhere. And England, I think, is such an interesting place. It's this big, it's tiny, right? And yeah, they had an industrial revolution, but their money came from being in Africa and being in India. And they took all of the products from there and it made them incredibly rich. So you're right, that without an Africa, Europe would not have the money it would have today. I think that another part of colonialism, though, is economic. And I think one of the big challenges is that you would have colonial powers that arrive in a place, and instead of fighting, they would present their goods for trade. And it wouldn't be cameras, because this is before that era of cameras, but it might have been many years ago metal objects, or manufactured objects, or clothing, or things like that, right? And people would look at those, and they would say, well, we don't like these people who are invading, but maybe these things have a value, right? Maybe a gun is worth much more than a spear of some sort, because the gun, we can kill an animal very quickly, we can eat much more quickly. So I think it's a difficult thing. I don't think I would appreciate colonialism. I think I would have forced those people to leave, and I would have wanted to fight against them. But I also think it's important to recognize the kinds of value. I think it's important to recognize the value that some of those objects that colonizers may have had. One thing that might have happened that I think would have been a good thing would be that if the colonists could have sat down with local people and made some agreement that said, okay, the colonists will respect the local traditions, they'll respect the local religions, they will not take products from the country without asking. But they can come to the market, they can trade, they can bring their items, and at least then the people can have the freedom to pick what they want, but not be forced into subjugation because some other people have a gun and they're saying, I want this land, this is mine now.
Okay, I would like for you to please advise our youth. As we now know, there's the popular saying, if you don't just like Lewin, your flop, or your this, or your that, you now tend to see boys putting your trousers below your waist, as normally it's supposed to be around your waist. Boys, instead of sticking in, you see them like removing your button in the name of what they call flashing. At times you see the way they behave, putting earrings on your ears. Even girls too now, you see them trying to dress indecently, wearing short things, which are not really good African models, because the African model is to have a decent, cultured African woman, a woman who can cater for the house, for the family. That is a girl who is morally upright. But right now, because of technologies like the internet and images in which the children view through publications and how can I put it, advertisements on the pillars, on the roads, they tend to behave forwardly, thinking that they're Americans, or I don't know, they still tend to see them as superior to their own culture. So how will you advise them?
That's a good question. I should start by saying that things like, television and the media are out there, and we can't just shut them off, right? I mean, I hope we are turning our televisions off and we're reading books, but it's important to be a part of the media and of the world, and the internet is a good thing. I don't think that it's a bad thing. But I agree that there are lots of bad influences out there. And one thing I worry about, especially with things like movies, is I worry that people watch a movie about America and they think, okay, that's how I should act if I want to be more like an American or something like that. So I think I would give a couple pieces of advice. One is that not everything you see on television or in the movies is true. And not everything that you see in television or in the movies is the way that America works or that Europe works, right? In those places and in Cameroon, it's important to be respectable and to be decent, to make sure that you're wearing clothing that's appropriate, to make sure that you're respecting your elders, right? All of those things that are important here, I think are true elsewhere around the world. So I think that's one thing, is just don't believe everything you see on television, and know that if you're going to get ahead in life and get a good job and be educated, it's important to stick to things like school and respecting your parents. And it's important to make sure that those things that your parents are telling you to do, that those are the things you should continue doing, because those are the things that are going to get you ahead. Not, wearing baggy clothes and ignoring school and, just watching television all day, because it doesn't work here and it doesn't work in America either, right? The other thing I would say is that traditional cultures in Cameroon are incredibly important things, and they're things that this country has had for thousands and thousands of years. And if children don't hold on to them, don't learn their languages and learn their foods and know that culture, then it will be gone, right? And it would be a tragedy if those cultures were to go. So I think another thing I would say is, sure, look on the internet, watch movies, be a part of that media, but don't forget the things that your parents are teaching you. Don't lose your language, right? Learn English, but also learn your tribal language and teach it to your kids so that these things don't die away, because these are incredibly important legacies that Africa has. And if you lose those things, then Africa is going to start losing what is true about Africa, right? Africa will no longer quite be the same place as it is now. So I think those are incredibly important things to remember and to hold on to and to not lose.
So far, have you been enjoying your stay in Cameroon and its cultures?
Very much. I really, really love being in Cameroon, and I think the thing I love most of all is getting to learn a little bit more about Cameroonian culture. I've gotten to see Cameroonian culture in a couple different places, but in a lot of ways I see it every day. So I've gotten to travel a little bit, I've seen festivals, I've seen funerals and weddings and cry-dyes, and I've gotten to see a lot of these things, and it's so cool to see how people live and how people do that. And it's also really cool to think about how it's similar and different to what we do, right? Because we have funerals too, but they look a little bit different.
Well, it was really nice meeting you and having a little bit of your time for this interview. Well, we certainly do hope that the youths back at home heard what he said. Like he said, you should not only base your mind on what you see on the television, for not all what you see is true. You should also focus on your culture and your studies, for you are the backbone of Cameroon, and if you must preserve your culture, you must make a change by trying to improve on yourself, by knowing your languages, respecting your parents, and also growing up morally alright. Well, we want to thank our guest again once more for giving us his time. Thank you, sir, and we really do hope you enjoy your time here in Cameroon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wena bobe bwa batone bunya bo matimba jesele